Hello and welcome to the What's the Story podcast. I'm Jarlath Kyan.
And I'm Victoria Houston. Each week we'll be focusing on the stories that matter to you. Stories about the people and places that make Tyrone so special.
The What's the Story podcast is brought to you by the Northwest News Group, who also print our much-loved newspapers, the Ulster Herald, Strabane Chronicle and the Tyrone Herald. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the What's the Story podcast. I'm Kieran O'Neill. Today we're looking at the fascinating story of a clothing company which was once one of the biggest employers in Tyrone. At its height, Desmonds was the largest privately owned company in the north. It supplied garments to Marks and Spencer and at its peak employed thousands of workers with an annual turnover of £100 million. It had a significant number of factories west of the Ban, including in Omagh and Dungannon. Many friendships were made on the factory floor, and Desmonds was a big part of life for so many local families down through the generations. However, the firm went into voluntary liquidation 20 years ago, and sadly all that's left now are a few derelict factories. No one knows the story of Desmonds better than Johnny Hamill, who has written a book about the company, and I'm delighted to welcome Johnny to the podcast this week. Johnny, thank you for your time, and when we look at the story of Desmonds, it really can be traced back to one remarkable woman. So who was Bridget Desmond?
Bridget Desmond was a remarkable woman, and the story of Desmonds is a remarkable story, but she came from very unremarkable, almost humble origins. So Bridget Byrne, as she was born into a farming family in County Donegal in the 1860s, 1861, 1862 she was born. One of the younger daughters of quite a large family, and that family, father was Felix Byrne and the mum was Roseanne McGowan, and they were very unremarkable farming families that in Killygordon in County Donegal, small farm. The eldest son inherited that land, and there were no economic prospects, no employment prospects for any of the rest of the family, so they were forced by poverty to become economic migrants, and the whole family moved to Glasgow. And it's in Glasgow in 1881 that we were able to pick them up there on the Scottish census. And Bridget Desmond, the woman who puts everything that was to follow into place, is working as a domestic servant. She's effectively a maid in a large house. So she certainly wasn't born into privilege. Her career path wasn't laid out for her. You know, she was a self-made woman.
And so she meets John Desmond. How did they meet? Was it in Glasgow that they met up?
Yes, they did. Yeah, they met in Glasgow. John Desmond's father, also John, had moved to Claudy up in County Londonderry, and he was a cabinet maker, a carpenter, but he also ran a public house, so he was a publican as well. And his son John went.
Where had they moved from, Johnny?
From County Cork.
Cork?
From Cork, yeah. Right. Desmonds are originally a Cork family, very much.
And what would have brought them up so far?
Well, John's father had been an itinerant carpenter, so he would have followed country fairs, agricultural fairs. He would have just gone mending agricultural implements, doing the wooden parts of that, and also just helping out around various farms and houses, fixing and repairing wooden items for them, and he would have moved around, and we're not sure why, but it's in Claudy that he eventually settles.
Yeah.
And his son John then goes over to Glasgow, and he's recorded as a spirit merchant, which would be someone involved in the liquor trade. And not sure why he was there, but one or two reasons is likely. He was either there to gain more experience of the licensing trade with a view to taking over from his father, or maybe he was there to try and establish some business links. You know, maybe set up some partnerships, establish links with some of the large Scottish vintners and importers to try and boost the business back home. But I suppose you'd have that large sort of Irish and Catholic community, as both Bridget and John were, coming together in Glasgow, and they met in Glasgow. And in 1884, they married there too. And tradition very much then as now would be you would marry in the bride's parish. So that would suggest that there was very little in Killygordon for Bridget to go back to. Now, we know that her father was still alive, but her mother, Roseanne, had died by the time of her marriage. So they married in Glasgow because that's where Bridget had made her home. That's where a number of her siblings were. So I think at that time probably she didn't have any intention of going back to the northwest of Ireland. But after she meets John Desmond, the two of them realise that John's financial prospects, his prospects are much better than hers. So they go with him.
Would he have been seen as, in comparison to her, quite wealthy at that time, or?
Yes, he would have been. The Desmonds were quite well established in Claudy. I mean, John had a good business there as a cabinet maker. We know that also in the pub he had like an auction yard at the back. They would have had livestock auctions there. So yeah, John Desmond was quite well established. Would have been quite a bit of a big noise in Claudy even at that time, just given the importance of a carpenter and indeed a publican to the local community.
So they come back to Claudy and set up home there. I suppose that's where the real origins of the Desmonds company started. How did the company come to fruition, or how was that created?
Well, whenever they come back to Claudy in 1885, they start a family, and Bridget starts the business at the same time. She starts off as an agent for Tilly and Henderson. Tilly and Henderson, one of the largest shirt manufacturers in the whole Derry shirt trade. Still a famous name even to this day. Strangely enough, Desmonds ended up employing more people, I think, than Tilly's ever did. But Tilly's would still be the name people remember. Yeah. Desmonds, to a large extent, certainly I would say amongst the under 30s, maybe would have been largely forgotten. But the large shirt manufacturers would have advertised for agents in the outlying districts, and Bridget will have responded to one of those adverts, and she will have become an agent for Tilly's. And it would have been a shirt depot rather than a factory, so there would be no manufacturing taking place on site. So Bridget, we know, took a horse and cart once a week by herself, and she made that journey from Claudy up to Derry, to Tilly and Henderson's, and there she would have collected parcels of pre-cut shirts. So Tilly's would have got in the large webs of cotton or linen cloth, and they would have cut those up very much like you would see a pattern today for dressmaking or trouser making or something like that. And Tilly's would have cut those pieces out and bundled them up in packets of dozens, and given then strict instructions along with the thread, the buttons and the labels to agents such as Bridget. She took those back to Claudy, and from there then she distributed them to women who were living in the surrounding area. Women who had, I suppose they would have had that skill. I mean, at that time, everybody would have been able to, use a needle and thread very proficiently. Very few would have had sewing machines, but that's another interesting fact about Bridget that we'll chat about in a moment. But the woman then in those rural farms would have been able to contribute to the family income by doing a little bit of stitching or sewing out of season or on a rainy day or in the evenings. And they were living too far away from Derry to be able to make that trip on a daily basis. So they couldn't be fully employed. But the likes of Tilly and Henderson and Bridget recognised that there was that untapped skill within the rural areas. And Bridget was one who capitalised on that. So as you say,
she went and got the garments from Tilly and Henderson and her horse and cart, and then obviously would have went round these houses and the horse and cart, or how would that have worked? Or?
No, she wouldn't have gone round the horse. She wouldn't have gone round. She would have brought those all back to Claudy, and then the woman would have come into Claudy to collect those shirts from her. So Bridget may have one day a week, a set day each week, she would have gone up to Tilly and Henderson's. So leading up to that then, the woman would have come in with the shirts that they had completed within that week and given them back to Bridget. She would have conducted her own sort of quality assurance tests. She would have checked them for holes. She would have checked them for the evenness of stitching. She would have made sure that the buttons and buttonholes all lined up. So a lot of checking there. She would have had a lot of strength of character, because she's still a 23-year-old girl at this stage. She's a very young woman. She's not well known in the Claudy area, and she's from County Donegal. So you could see there could have been a wee bit of kickback there. Some of the people that she was employing would have been maybe twice her age. But it doesn't seem to have been a problem for Bridget. She held that business together, and she in fact grew that first business of hers extremely successfully. And if any of those garments didn't come up to muster, Bridget would have had to put in a challenge to those women, either not paid them or ultimately have dismissed them. And I think for a 23-year-old woman who's just arrived back from Glasgow, from Donegal into Claudia, I think that is quite that is quite an achievement.
And especially for that time, for a woman to be so entrepreneurial and kind of effectively launching her own business, and it would have been unusual in those days.
Extremely unusual, yeah, extremely unusual. There were other women who would have been agents, because they would have had the skill set, they would have had the knowledge, they would have been able to identify whether or not the garment had been manufactured properly. They would have been able to point out errors. But Bridget is the only one who actually develops that business from a depot out into a factory. A lot of those other depots simply faded away. The outworking system was problematic. Whenever you're putting garments out to women, you didn't know what you were going to get back. You didn't know when. You had very little control over it. And if you're trying to run a business and you're trying to meet deadlines, it's difficult. And that's ultimately what Bridget and her husband John identified, and they ultimately then decided to move away from Tilly and Henderson, strike out on their own, and have their own factory.
So how does the company develop from that small setup to the next stage?
From quite early on, we know Bridget is very ambitious, and that was a trait that she established, and a trait that carried on throughout the whole of Desmonds, right the way through until the company went into voluntary liquidation in the first decade of the 21st century. Bridget made sure that everything was efficient, that there was no wastage, that the quality was top, but also that she looked after her workers. And we think that Bridget had been forced to leave the community of her birth because of the lack of opportunities that existed for women. And she resolved to give women in the area those opportunities so that they were able to at least have that choice. If they wanted to stay locally, they had an opportunity to earn money, secure their own independence, or help with the income from the family unit. So Bridget starts off by employing a lot of friends and family. And
a lot of women in particular?
Sorry?
Mainly women?
All women.
All women? Right.
All women stitchers, yeah. It was all women stitchers that Bridget employed. It was one of those just things with the textile trade was all predominantly female shop floor workers, even in Derry's shirt factories and indeed the linen factories of Belfast, Lisburn and elsewhere. It would have been predominantly a female trade. Male mechanics, male oilers, male supervisors to an extent, but it was a female workforce that she employed. So
therefore, how do they go to the next level in terms of, do they set up a factory then, or where's that set up?
Yes, they do. See, Bridget benefited from John's business. John had a pub as a bar, as an accountant. And it was on that counter that Bridget was able to examine the cloth that the woman brought in. So she was able to lay these shirts out on that large flat wooden surface and examine all of those items. And also with being a publican, she had ready access to cash. So she was able to pay the woman. There was cash in that business, so it worked well for them. But between 1885, when they set up the business, in 1897, Bridget and John ran their businesses separately. John is still a carpenter and Bridget is a shirt manufacturer. And we know that from the children's baptismal certificates. On a child's baptismal certificate, the father's occupation is recorded. John Desmond records his occupation as either carpenter or cabinet maker up until 1897. From 1897 onwards, he records himself as a shirt manufacturer. So what he does is he turns his back on his own business, a business that his father and his grandfather had been involved in, and that's the carpentry business. So he rids his carpenter shop of all the lathes and saws and all the other trappings of carpentry, and he turns his workshop into their factory. And at this point, John Desmond realises that his wife's prospects are better than his, and so he decides to jettison his career and throw his lot in with her. And he doesn't take over. They become very much partners in business as they were partners in life.
Yeah.
And they turn his workshop
and they have quite a few
to her factory.
children, didn't they? Or how many children would they have?
I think it was 13.
13 children?
Not all survived to adulthood,
Right,
but yes.
So they had a busy household, and yet both very business focused as well. They come together to what they see as a good business, and ultimately proves to be such. So the fact they set up in Claudy, then what's the next stage of Desmond's development?
Well, it grows. They begin to service a lot of independent shirt manufacturers throughout the whole of the north of Ireland. And a lot of those records are still extant, and the order books show that they are dealing with multiple customers. So they're building a good reputation. They're winning custom from elsewhere, and they're growing the business. So they buy a farmhouse in Claudy, which is opposite where the primary school is. Sorry, it's on the site where the primary school is now.
Yeah.
And they built a purpose-built annex onto that. That was the first factory that they'd ever actually built.
Yeah.
Prior to that, you don't think it was in the converted premises. And the business continued to grow and grow and grow. And after the Second World War, I should say Bridget dies young. Bridget dies in 1911.
Yeah.
She dies at the age of 48 or 49. But without doubt, she had put into motion everything else that was to follow. And her son, Major James Desmond, and her grandson, Sir Denis Desmond, were true to her ideals. They followed her culture, and it certainly stood them in good stead. And in 1948, then, they built the factory that's still there today. It's opposite the primary school in Claudy. And the people in Claudy, Sir Denis remembers just the move from one factory to the other. And he remembers the people in Claudy shaking their heads and going, "This is ridiculous. Look at the size of that place. You know, there's no way that's ever going to work." And they ended up then expanding it, almost doubling it in size, just as the firm's reputation grew. And the reputation was for quality, the reputation was for price, and the reputation was for delivering on time.
And I don't know if this is post Second World War, and it's all on an upward trajectory, the company, but when does the relationship with Marks and Spencer's happen, or when does that come in, which really takes it to another level?
Well, the Marks and Spencer's were just one of several customers or companies that Desmonds would have worked for. But we have to remember back here in the late 1940s, which is when the relationship with Marks and Spencer's first started, Marks and Spencer's were kings. They were without doubt the single largest garment retailer in the United Kingdom. They have very, very little to touch them. So Desmonds were finding that they were dealing with maybe small orders. People were coming in asking for a couple of dozen shirts, and Marks and Spencer would come with an order that was worth maybe £1,500 in the late 1940s, early 1950s, which is massive for them to be able to incorporate into their business model. And in 1959, John Fry, who's one of Marks and Spencer's executives, sent Desmonds a couple of pairs of trousers and said, I think it was unsolicited, he just sent them a couple of pairs of trousers and said, "We would like you to replicate these for us. Do you think you could do it?" But the scale of Marks and Spencer's business meant that Desmonds had to make a very difficult choice. They could either continue to service all of the smaller companies that they had done, or they could throw their lot in with Marks and Spencer's and manufacture almost exclusively for them. And that's the decision that they chose, that they would align themselves, their culture, their ethos, the manufacturing sites, they would align themselves totally with Marks and Spencer's. And that was the niche that John Desmond and Major James Desmond chose for the firm.
Yeah. And that was the late 50s?
The late 50s.
And as I said, that just really takes it to a different level completely. What was the development of the company after that relationship started?
Well, that saw Desmonds open a new factory in Dungannon. Dungannon was their third factory. They had outgrown Claudy. They then moved to a factory in Swatra. And then Dungannon was the factory that they built for Marks and Spencer's. And that was one of their business models. Small to medium sized, highly efficient, and in rural areas. Because Bridget Desmond had always wanted her factories to be a community amenity. She said she didn't want the doors to be locked at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock on a Friday evening. She wanted the doors open on a Saturday evening so that people could come in and have a public meeting, so they could have a jumble sale, a fair, a bazaar, a sports day, a dance. And that's what she did. She wanted her, I'm going to use an awful textile pun here, but she wanted the factories to be the glue that sort of bound the fabric of society together.
Yeah. And is that the way it worked out for the majority of the time? Yeah.
Yes, it is. It is. The Sir Denis, when I was interviewing him, I'd heard this reference to Desmond's Starlight Ballroom, and I could not find out for the life of me where Desmond's Starlight Ballroom was in the old maps. I couldn't see it marked anywhere, but I did see a lot of references to it. I knew it was like a disco type nightclub sort of place, but I also knew that it was dry, it was alcohol free. And I asked Sir Denis where it was, and he said, "No, that was the canteen." Right. That was the canteen in Claudy, and it was built dual purpose. It had a wooden floor. And a wooden floor in a canteen is not very practical. You would have had some other sort of flooring, but they designed it dual purpose. So during the day, Monday to Friday, it was a factory canteen. Come the weekend, they cleared the tables and chairs out of the way, and they would have had show bands and other groups in there playing music, and the workers and invited guests would have danced the night away. And I think that helped pull everybody together. You know, it helped create that overlap between your work colleague and your friends. But being based in a small village, everybody would have known each other really anyway. And that helped too, because if the woman beside you, and again I say woman because they were all female stitchers, if the woman beside you is having trouble with her work, because you're all on piece rates, so you're paid according to the amount that you produce, so the more garments you make, the more money you make. As Denis would have said, the more you make, the more you make. Yeah. If you were to stop work to help that person beside you, you were reducing your own earnings, you were reducing your own income. And in some of the larger, more anonymous factories, city factories, that wouldn't have happened. But in Desmonds it always did, because the person beside you, if they weren't a relative or a neighbour or somebody you were at school with, it might have been somebody you were at the dance with on Saturday. So you had that overlap. Everybody treated each other as friends, and it was an industrial community. Everybody pulling together. That singularity of purpose fed into Desmond's idea of a team and their idea of reducing waste and being as efficient as they possibly could. And it meant as well, come Monday morning, if you're walking up those steps to the factory, you weren't looking at it thinking, here's this place again, here we go. You're not thinking about banks and banks of sewing machines and the whirring noise and the heat and the hard work and the stress or pressure of it all. You're maybe thinking about Saturday night and the dance you had in the same building. So it blurs those edges. It sort of takes away that sort of Monday morning blues, if you could call them that. And
what do we know about in terms of it was obviously part of their growth that they move on the Tyrone. They open a factory in Omagh, and there was one in Dungannon as well. So what do we know about the creation of those factories?
Desmonds believes in specialisation. So a lot of the factories would have produced one or a small number of garments. So rather than every factory maybe producing shirts and nightwear, because Desmond's a big line in pyjamas, and outerwear, jackets and anoraks and things they did as well. They would have specialised in factories. So they opened the Dungannon factory specifically to make trousers for Marks and Spencer's. They then opened one in Irvinstown, was after Dungannon, and Irvinstown was initially designed to make boys' shirts, school uniform shirts. But Marks and Spencer then realised that there's a big glut in the market. They actually didn't need as many boys' shirts as they thought, and they asked Desmonds, could you change to make leisure wear sweatshirts, in effect? And Desmond said, yes, we can. And this is what really cemented Desmond's relationship with Marks and Spencer. Desmond's managed to transition from cotton shirts to sweatshirts, which is almost like a knitted woolen type, or man-made fabric. Again, another awful textile pun, I'm sorry, seamlessly. No grumbling, no drop in quality, and they did it so quickly that Marks and Spencer's realised that this is a firm we can rely on. They can adapt, they're flexible, they can respond immediately to changes in fashion, and as the fashion industry, the garment manufacturing trade becomes globalised, becomes worldwide, that's important, hugely important in terms of fast fashion. Things are maybe worn for one season and then thrown out. You have to be able to respond to trends immediately. And what Desmonds did in Irvinstown showed Marks and Spencer that they were a partner that could be relied on. And Desmonds from that point on really became not just a manufacturer for Marks and Spencer's, but they actually became a partner to a large extent. And Marks and Spencer came to trust and rely upon Desmond's judgment. And then in 1976, Desmonds were approached and asked if they would consider taking over the Ailing-Stevens Brothers shirt and collar manufacturing company here in Omagh, which it's on the site of the new cinema, just where Festival Park is now. And that had been set up in 1949 as part of the post-war economic or industrial regeneration. It was called like an advance factory. It was opened by the Minister of Commerce, John Maynard Sinclair, in 1949, and it ran until 1976. And at that time, it was really facing closure through no fault of any of the managers or staff there. It simply was that the preconditions that existed for the manufacture of shirts in Northern Ireland had largely ceased to exist. A lot of the supply chains were already were closed. Very, very difficult to make business. And Desmond said yes, that they would. And there were financial incentives offered to Desmond.
Asked by who? Marks and Spencer's or the Department of Commerce? Or
Department of Commerce.
Right.
Department of Commerce. The
Okay.
Department of Commerce didn't want to see a huge amount of unemployment coming to an area such as Omagh. There was already rising unemployment in Omagh at the time, and they did not want to see this happen. And those skills, those workers in Stevens Brothers, they were highly skilled, but those skills weren't transferable. Those skills couldn't be used really outside the garment manufacturing industry. So Desmonds were able to come in, and they had a look at the building, they had a look at the workforce, they had a look at the management structure, and they said, yes, we can work with this. And they did retain a large proportion of those workers, and they also retained a large amount of the management structure. In particular, one man I know that Sir Denis was very impressed with was a guy called John McMahon. And John McMahon ended up going to set up a lot of Desmond's overseas factories as well.
So that was in the mid-70s. What work did the Omagh factory take on, or what was their plan for it?
Omagh produced, the main line they produced were crease-resistant chino trousers. That was the main line that they produced. And Omagh actually ends up being the largest factory in Desmond's portfolio of factories, which was effectively a dozen factories within the United Kingdom, because they had an outlet in Cheshire, Max Bernstein shirts as well, and then the overseas factories. But Omagh ended up, I think, with about 550 employees and became the single largest factory. And Desmonds, again, put in a lot of technology into Omagh. In particular, they had an overhead rail system. So the old idea of where one woman would have got a shirt, and nobody would have made a shirt from start to finish. Whenever Bridget would have put garments out, then yes, one woman would have done everything. She'd have sewed the cuffs, the collars, the yokes, the buttonholes, the buttons. She would have done the whole lot. But Desmond's, obviously for efficiency reasons, broke that down. It became a production line. So you would have had a hem seamer. Somebody would have done collars, somebody would have done buttonholes, and would have passed along the production line. But Desmond's had an idea of an overhead rail system. So the garments would have appeared overhead, and the worker would have reached up, pulled that down, sewn it, did her bit to it and let it go, it would have sprung back up and gone on then to the next woman, and she would have done the next.
Which would have been the height of technology at the time.
Very much so. And that overhead rail system, I've heard people referring to it as a swoosh. The vans from Desmonds would have arrived, or the lorries would have appeared at the loading bays, and all those garments, once they were manufactured, they were still on overhead rails. The overhead rails from the loading bay met the overhead rails that were in the lorries, so they were literally just swooshed from the factory into the lorry. All those garments then went up to Drumahoe, which was up in Derry, where Desmond's warehouse was, and that warehouse had been, I don't actually remember what it was beforehand. It was a massive warehouse, which Desmonds took over, and again they put the overhead rails in there. So when the lorries arrived at Drumahoe, again they were swooshed directly off, so there was no carrying stuff about, and that was all computerized. And Desmonds eventually had that system down to such a fine degree that if, for instance, Marks and Spencer said, we want one pair of men's chinos, long leg, 34-inch waist, Desmonds could have just stood somewhere, pressed a couple of buttons, and the whole automated system would have meant that one item, would have been found somewhere in that warehouse, automatic on that rail system, and that one garment would have just automatically appeared, ready for dispatch. And Marks and Spencer's actually sent other of their suppliers over to Drumahoe because Desmonds had the enviable reputation of being the most accurate of all the suppliers in terms of fulfilling orders. Because some of the shops were saying, we ordered 10 dozen size 12s, and we've got 6 size 12s, and the rest are assorted things. So to try and eliminate that, a lot of the suppliers were sent over to Drumahoe, sent over to Desmonds. Marks and Spencer said, you're not up to scratch here. Get yourselves over to Northern Ireland, go up to Drumahoe and have a look at what they're doing and replicate that. What you said that that Marks and Spencer's did end up coming very much to trust and rely upon Desmonds. Yeah.
And what do we know about the operation in Dungannon? When did that open?
I'm a bit struggling now on the Dungannon one. Dungannon opened after Omagh, and it also was involved in outerwear. I think it's sort of jackets, anoraks and things that Dungannon would have opened. But Desmonds had always wanted to stay away from larger towns, and as the early history of the firm shows, they wanted to be able to harness that idea of community.
So I know, growing up in the 80s, getting a job in Desmonds was seen as a fantastic opportunity, a job for life as such, and it was a hugely successful company. When did it reach its peak in terms of how successful it was?
It would have reached its peak really in the mid to late 90s. That was whenever Desmonds really was at its peak, because they would have invested heavily in technology and in production lines, workflow systems, just to make sure that they were that efficient, that they were eliminating wastage. And that's when Marks and Spencer's probably were at their peak as well, because Desmonds realised that although yes, they were producing for Marks and Spencer and they had to satisfy Marks and Spencer's buyers, they also ultimately had to satisfy Marks and Spencer's customers. Because if Marks and Spencer's trade declined, Desmond's trade would decline. So there was always that balance. Marks and Spencer's might have come in and said, this is what we want, and given specifications to Desmond, say, for a pair of chinos, as they were doing in Omagh. But Desmond's had a design studio, an office over in London, which was deliberately within walking distance of Baker Street, which is where Marks and Spencer's headquarters were. They deliberately bought that premises that close, just so they could align themselves to that. And in that, they had fashion designers. And those designers would have gone to the fashion capitals of the world to have a look to see what was happening. in the world of fashion, knowing that what's happened in Milan and New York and Paris in a diluted form will pass down onto the high street in a couple of years. So if Marks and Spencer now said, yeah, this is what we want you to produce, Desmonds would have produced that accurately and reliably and said, this is what you've asked for. And then they would have had a couple of other things, said that this is what we think you want, this is what we think you need, this is what we think you should be considering to put on the shelves.
Yeah.
And that would have been Desmond's interpretation of Marks and Spencer's brief. And Marks and Spencer's would have always said they wanted newness, but at the same time there was always that conservativeness with them. They didn't really want to go too far away from what would have been their traditional customer base. But Desmonds realised that you have to keep pushing. You have to keep pushing. And they realised that if Marks and Spencer's were successful, they'd be successful. If Marks and Spencer's failed, that they would fail. The companies were that closely aligned.
So that's my next question: is when did the problem start arising? And I assume it's because of the closeness of that relationship.
It is, yeah. Unfortunately, it is. Desmonds took the opportunity in 1959 to align themselves completely with Marks and Spencer's. If they hadn't, somebody else would have. And it was Desmonds that survived. It was Desmonds that prospered. All of the other small companies that would have been around at the same time as Desmonds, the stitching factories, went to the wall. They went to the wall. Marks and Spencer had always prided themselves on being a British company. It was everything was produced within the United Kingdom. It was produced ethically, and people didn't mind paying maybe that little bit extra because they were paying for quality and they were paying to support local jobs. Textile manufacturing became global, and the garment manufacturing industry became globalized too. You're competing, it's not a level playing field. If you're competing against countries that are paying a fraction of the wages that you're paying, if you're competing against companies that are not adhering to the same levels of maybe health and safety that you're adhering to, if you're competing against companies that aren't limited by the number of hours that they can work, if they can put more machines in a confined space, it's not a level playing field. And a lot of Marks and Spencer's competitors were sourcing their garments from overseas. So if, just plucking figures out of the air, if Desmonds can produce an item at £5 cost price to them and send that on to Marks and Spencer obviously have to put they have to up price that so they can make money as well. So that garment might come out maybe at £10 on the rail. But if their competitors are only paying £1 for their items, then they can put those items on the rail for £6. They're making the same amount of profit as M&S are. But whenever you're faced with two items of comparable quality, price is becoming key. Certainly with the younger customer base, price is becoming key. And when you move into the era of fast fashion, which is where items you're not really looking for quality, you're not looking for durability, you're looking for style. Price is incredibly important. It's different if you buy something, you would invest in a Marks and Spencer's dress or jacket or suit because you're going to have it for years. But if you open your wardrobe and you have a look at it and go, oh, I can't wear that, that's so last year, it's going in the bin, or it's going to end up in a charity shop, or it's going to be cut up for rags. So the problem that was faced by both Desmonds and Marks and Spencer's was that idea of increased pressure, overseas competition. And Desmonds did try and adapt to that. It was Desmonds who persuaded Marks and Spencer's to allow them to source fabric overseas, provided that fabric met with their own and Marks and Spencer's quality standards. And Desmonds also got involved in what they called JV, joint venture companies, whereby they would have had garments produced for them overseas in the likes of Morocco, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, again making sure that the quality standards were maintained, because the preconditions that existed for garment manufacturing in Northern Ireland had simply ceased to exist. It wasn't financially viable, economically possible to produce garments competitively in Northern Ireland. If Desmonds couldn't do it, nobody could.
So how did the downfall of the company happen? Was it a slow gradual process, or was it an overnight thing, or
It was quite sudden. Marks and Spencer's had what was called the McKinsey report in 1999, and that was external consultants. They'd asked just to have a look at their business model, and they recommended that Marks and Spencer's did away with what was called a full service provider. And Desmonds, by getting involved in these joint venture products, had inadvertently inserted an extra link in that chain. So where it had been that Desmonds produced for Marks and Spencer, you now had these overseas factories producing for Desmonds to sell to Marks and Spencer. So the decision was taken by Marks and Spencer to do away with full service providers such as Desmonds, and it was quite abrupt. I mean, Desmonds were certainly given the opportunity to fulfill their current contracts, but the decision, they were told really that no longer will Marks and Spencer be sourcing garments from Desmonds. And if you have a dozen factories, you've 3,000 employees, you've 100 million turnover in a year, to try and find an outlet for that manufacturing capacity in a short space of time, whenever all of the other retailers on the high street already have their supply chains established, it was virtually impossible. And so the difficult decision was taken to liquidate the company.
So when was that, and how was that process? Did the factories close fairly quickly?
The factories tumbled. The first one to go, I think, was Enniskillen, Raceview Enniskillen, in about 1999. And then there was a couple others in 2000. 2002 saw the closure of Omagh. That was 2002, 2003, that most of the factories had closed. I think Desmonds did have that model whereby they hoped they would be able to compete in a global market, because Desmonds always would have seen opportunities rather than threats. They never looked for protective tariffs. They never looked for anything like that. They obviously did apply for government assistance in terms of investment in new machinery, new technology. And what they hoped to do was to keep their design studios, their headquarters, and their warehousing within Northern Ireland, that expertise here, and then outsource garment manufacturing overseas. But Marks and Spencer then determined that they were going to do away with the full service providers. And Desmonds tried to rationalise, they tried to maintain that competitive, but it simply wasn't possible. And so the factories tumbled from 1999 to 2003, and the last one to close, the Drumahoe warehouse closed, and the last one to close then was Claudy, and they had a last of hurrah. It was called Zip Claudy, and the idea of Zip was that idea of speed, that it was to be a small specialized sample unit almost, that if Marks and Spencer wanted something done, they would go to Claudy Zip, and they would be able to turn that around, from a design, from what would have been CAD at the time, would have been computer aided design. So, from screen to hanger, Desmond said, we can turn that around in a matter of days for you.
Yeah.
And then, if that was good, then they would send it off to large scale manufacturing. And so there was a lot of attempts there to try and get that done. But again, it's the same thing that happened with the Stephen Brothers, the shirt and collar manufacturer. The employees in Desmonds had no transferable skills. They were stitchers, and there was nowhere else in Northern Ireland hiring stitchers. And you're quite right, Kieran, when you say that it was a job for life. There was people who got into Desmonds believed that this was them. It was secure. It was solid. And there was a lot of difficulties for people. I'd say emotionally as well as financially whenever the premises closed. But there were a lot of reporters went around the factories when they did close, because Desmonds would have announced the closure because they're always running out, the contracts for M&S. And when the reporters went out and spoke to the employees, they were of course concerned for the future, absolutely, understandably, but they were also really upset at losing a way of life, at losing friends, at losing that idea of social life. And everyone I've spoken to who worked in Desmonds, and I'm very careful about this sort of thing because as it rose-tinted glasses, looking back fondly. But everyone says no. You know, their time in Desmonds, it was hard. You know, they had to work hard. There was a lot of pressure. But they all look back on their times fondly. You know, they said a lot of friendships were a lot of friendships.
And that's something, that legacy continues. Like, obviously you wrote the book. There was a lot of interest in that. And now you take part in talks in terms about the history of Desmonds. And I know any time that we cover a story in terms of the history of Desmonds, particularly in Omagh, there's always a lot of action. And as what you were saying there about the friendships that were made, the memories of it. But you get that sense that there was a real pride and closeness within that Desmond's family.
Absolutely. There was a Desmond's company magazine called Behind the Scenes, and because it was so big, they actually were able to offer people like discounts in it. So, you know, companies would have advertised. It was Woolworths offered 10% off here at the Omagh store to anybody who worked in Desmonds, because they had that purchasing power. It had almost had its own like births, deaths, and marriage column. There's congratulations given to, you know, somebody who in one of the factories who had, you know, just given birth, or somebody who had left to get married, or, you know, somebody's, you know, someone dear to you had passed away, but with permission, of course. Those sorts of things were published and printed in that magazine. There were what were called community chests in every one of the factories, whereby people would have identified a local charity. And when I say local, it's not local to Northern Ireland, but local to that factory. So Enniskillen did something for the Romanian orphanages. It was Action Cancer here in Omagh, and Desmonds would have supported that. Sometimes they matched the amount of money that would have been raised within each factory, just to try and pull that whole thing together. And in the end, Desmonds worked a 4.5-day week. So we had a half day on Friday. And in Omagh, it was known as Max Factor Friday. The Max Factor Friday, I've been told, was because what the woman would have done is they'd have arrived into work, but they would have had their glad rags with them. They would have had the makeup with them, and they would have had the party frock with them. And after finishing work, when they got paid, they didn't go home, and they didn't go out with other friends. They all got changed in the factory, and they went straight out in the town. So even the likes of Bridget Desmond, you know, in the very early days about wanting people to come into her factory and see it as a community amenity, that idea of the factory being one big family, you know, carried right the way through to Desmonds and Omagh, right up until the very day it closed.